The tow truck's chain clanged against the hitch of my boat trailer, and I swear I almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so absurd. Imagine sipping your morning coffee, looking out your window, and seeing a bright orange HHOA vest peeking over your fence while some random driver inches your 30-foot fishing boat toward the street. My boat wasn't just property, it was my floating escape, the one thing keeping me sane through suburban nonsense. And here was Karen, president of our HOA, standing in her driveway with folded arms and a smirk, orchestrating the theft like she was Napoleon reclaiming lost territory. The driver looked nervous. He kept glancing at the paperwork Karen shoved at him like it was supposed to be legal gospel. "She says it's in violation," he muttered, half apologetic. I didn't even bother hiding my grin. Violation of what? The Geneva Convention. The man chuckled before catching Karen's glare and straightening up. She barked something about community aesthetics and safety hazards, though the only hazard here was her unrelenting ego. I walked out slowly, sipping my coffee, and snapped a picture. Karen didn't like that. "You can't take pictures of me without consent," she snapped, which was hilarious given the dozen security cameras she'd personally lobbied to install around the neighborhood. I told her flatly that she was trespassing, the tow was unauthorized, and if that truck moved another inch, she and the driver would be explaining themselves to the police. The driver froze, chain dangling midair, clearly rethinking whether a few $100 from Karen was worth handcuff. Her voice went shrill. "The HLA has the right to enforce compliance," she insisted, waving a stapled packet of regulations she had obviously printed from a Word template she'd modified herself. I'd read the actual bylaws, and nowhere did they say a single word about boats stored behind a privacy fence on private land. Karen hated being contradicted, but I made sure my tone was surgical, not emotional. I told the driver I'd already called the sheriff's office, which wasn't true yet, but judging by the way Karen's jaw clenched, she wasn't eager for deputies to see her little stunt. He unhooked the chain with shaking hands and muttered something about needing clearer paperwork. Karen stomped off toward her house like a child denied candy, vowing this wasn't over. It wasn't just about the boat. It never is with people like Karen. For her, everything was a performance. She wanted to be seen as the neighborhood savior, the guardian of property values. She'd built her whole identity around controlling others. My boat was just the latest excuse. But what she didn't know was that I had patience, and patience is a far sharper weapon than temper. Over the next few days, flyers appeared on mailboxes, warning residents about unsightly vessels and the dangers of standing water. Karen loved to dress her vendettas in public service language, like she was preventing malaria rather than harassing her neighbor. I stayed calm, trimming my yard, waving at her when she scowled from across the street, and polishing the boat just enough to make the sun bounce off its hull like a mirror. And then came the storm. It was one of those freak summer downpours that turns streets into rivers in half an hour. Gutters overflowed, lawns became ponds, and Karen's backyard, sloped, poorly drained, and lacking the French drains I'd once suggested she install, turned into a shallow lake. By evening, she was pacing in rubber boots, screaming into her phone, demanding that city workers arrive with pump. That's when I had my idea. I walked out back, untied the ropes, and with the help of the floodwater, guided my boat gently through the side gate. My yard drained better than hers, so it took only a little maneuvering to float it across the fence line into the ankle-deep lagoon that was now Karen's backyard. There it bobbed, majestic, a gleaming vessel in a suburban sea. By the time Karen noticed, neighbors were already filming from their porches, laughing. Her shriek carried over the water like a siren. "Get that thing out of here!" she screamed, splashing toward it in her soaked yoga pants. I leaned against my fence, arms crossed, and told her calmly that technically, her yard was the only body of water in the neighborhood large enough to host a boat. Wasn't she always preaching about community sharing? The videos went viral before I even had to post my own. Neighbors titled them Backyard Marina and HOA queen meets her own harbor. Karen called the police, of course, but when they arrived, even they had to suppress smiles. One officer pointed out, deadpan, that it wasn't illegal to float a boat on water that existed naturally on private property, especially when that property wasn't mine. Karen sputtered about bylaws and aesthetics, but her words drowned beneath the sound of my boat gently bumping against her deck stairs. For once, she was the one being mocked, her authority dissolving faster than the floodwater. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. All I did was sip my coffee and watch her wade in circles, powerless against the absurdity of her own making. And that was just the beginning. Because once you crack Karen's armor in public, once the neighborhood realizes she can be beaten at her own game, the tide never goes back out. The next morning, Karen's backyard looked like a battlefield after the waterline receded. Mud streaks marked where the flood had licked her patio furniture, her prized rose bushes leaned sideways in exhaustion, and the once white fence posts were stained a sickly brown. And right there, in the middle of her yard, sat my boat, grounded, majestic, like some monument to her humiliation. It had floated perfectly until the water drained, then settled squarely onto her sodden grass, leaving ruts as wide as a car. When I came out to retrieve it, I found Karen already pacing in her yard, phone pressed against her ear. Her tone was clipped, venomous. "Yes, officer, the boat is still here. It's on my property now. This is trespassing, theft, vandalism, you name it." She waved one hand wildly in my direction, as if narrating her grievances live for the 911 dispatcher. I leaned casually against the fence, coffee in hand, and called out, "Don't forget maritime law, Karen. This might qualify as a Port Authority issue." Her head snapped toward me, hair plastered from yesterday's rain. "This isn't funny," she shouted. "You're going to pay for the damage you've caused." Damage? That was rich, considering my boat had floated harmlessly until her swamp of a backyard decided to host it. Still, I pretended to think. "You're right. Maybe you should send me an invoice. Let's see, cost of temporary mooring, dock fees, maybe a cleaning service? Should we call it even at $50? Her nostrils flared like a bull's. She turned her back to me, muttering into her phone. Within 15 minutes, a patrol car rolled up. 2 deputies got out, both wearing that mix of boredom and mild amusement that only suburban HOA disputes could inspire. Karen launched into her spiel, words tumbling over each other as she pointed at my boat like it was a weapon of mass destruction. The officers listened politely, then asked how the boat ended up in her yard. She gestured wildly at the clouds, blaming negligence and reckless endangerment. I explained in the calmest voice I could muster that the boat had floated naturally, carried by the floodwater. Honestly, gentlemen, I was just as surprised as anyone, but I thought it best to keep it safe from further damage, so I let it rest in the only harbor available. One deputy scratched his chin. "So, technically, it drifted into her yard?" I nodded. Karen exploded. "Technically? Technically?" He pushed it in. She had no proof, of course, only her conviction. The second deputy tried not to laugh, covering his mouth with his hand. They told her it was a civil matter, not criminal, and advised me to move the boat as soon as the ground was stable enough. Karen's outrage burned hotter than the July sun. Civil matter? This is criminal negligence. He's lowering property values. The officers gave her the kind of look that said they'd heard enough, then climbed back into their car and drove away. Karen screamed after them, demanding citations, but their taillights were already disappearing around the corner. I hired a tow service later that day, not the shady guy Karen had called, but a professional company with actual insurance. Watching the hydraulic trailer lift my boat from her soggy grass was oddly satisfying, especially when the workers tracked mud all across her lawn. Karen stood with crossed arms, documenting every tire mark like she was gathering evidence for The Hague. That evening, the HOA Facebook group lit up. Photos of my boat in Karen's backyard spread like wildfire. One neighbor captioned it, "Welcome to Lake Karen, complete with a wave emoji. Another posted, "Who knew she had waterfront property?" I didn't contribute, but I definitely watched the thread climb past 100 comments. Neighbors who had never spoken up against Karen suddenly found their voices, poking fun at her obsession with rules. Karen responded in the thread, of course. She accused me of orchestrating a public humiliation campaign, claimed the boat incident was deliberate sabotage, and demanded immediate fines and sanctions. The problem was, she hadn't bothered to consult the HOA board before firing off her threats. Within hours, other members pushed back, pointing out that her own yard's drainage had caused the problem, not my boat. That's when the board president, Mark, a mild accountant who hated drama, finally chimed in. He reminded everyone that only the board as a whole could issue fines, not a single member, even if that member was Karen. His tone was diplomatic, but you could read between the lines. He was tired of her antics. The real twist came 3 days later, when Karen called an emergency HOA meeting. She plastered flyers on mailboxes, insisting that community standards were under attack. Naturally, I attended. I sat in the back with a notebook, as if I were some disinterested observer, though I was savoring every second. The meeting room buzzed with low chatter until Karen marched in like a general preparing for battle. She had charts, actual poster boards, depicting the dangers of large vessels in residential areas. One diagram showed my boat drawn like a cartoon battleship, dwarfing houses, with lightning bolts striking it. She even had a bulleted list of potential consequences, including mosquito infestation, rodent harborage, and negative psychological impact on children. When she presented, her voice shook with theatrical passion. She called me reckless, selfish, a threat to neighborhood safety. She demanded the board create a new bylaw banning boats of any size on any property. She even proposed retroactive fines for violators. The room was silent for a beat, then someone chuckled. It spread like a ripple through the crowd. Neighbors couldn't take her seriously anymore, not after Lake Karen had become the running joke of the summer. One man raised his hand and asked if his inflatable pool counted as a large vessel. Another asked if toy sailboats would be prohibited. The laughter built until Karen's face flushed crimson. The board president cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable, and said they'd table her motion until a future session. Translation: this idea was dead on arrival. Karen slammed her papers onto the table, muttering about bias and conspiracies. She stormed out, leaving the rest of us to enjoy the absurdity. After the meeting, people I barely knew came up to me in the parking lot. They congratulated me for standing my ground, told me Karen had finally overplayed her hand, and even offered to help if she tried anything else. It wasn't just about the boat anymore. It was about balance shifting. For once, the neighborhood realized they didn't have to bow to Karen's tantrums. Back home, I stood on my porch, watching the sun dip behind the trees. The air was cooler, quieter, though I knew the storm wasn't over. Karen had lost a battle, but she wasn't the type to surrender. People like her never admit defeat. They just regroup, plot, and strike again from a different angle. I wasn't worried. I had patience. And I had an entire neighborhood starting to see her for what she was. But Karen? She wasn't done yet. Not even close. The quiet after the HOA meeting didn't last long. I knew Karen too well by now. Silence wasn't her surrender, it was her reloading. For a week or so, she vanished from the usual arenas. No Facebook rants, no flyers mysteriously taped to mailboxes, not even the shrill bark of her voice echoing across the cul-de-sac when someone parked too close to her curb. I almost started to worry. Not because I missed her, but because when Karen disappeared, it meant she was plotting something big. I got my answer on a Thursday morning. The city code enforcement truck pulled up outside my house, bright yellow hazard lights flashing. 2 inspectors climbed out with clipboards, surveying my driveway like they were about to condemn it. My stomach tightened, but I kept my face calm. I'd been expecting something like this. Karen didn't get her way with the HOA, so she was escalating to City Hall. The taller inspector introduced himself politely, said they'd received an anonymous complaint about hazardous materials and code violations on my property. His partner began snapping pictures of the boat, the shed, even my trash bins. When I asked what specific violations they were looking for, he shrugged. Standing water, pest harborage, improper storage. All suspiciously similar to Karen's earlier list of grievances. I invited them to take a full tour. Why not? My yard was cleaner than a showroom, my shed organized enough to impress a Marine drill sergeant, and my boat meticulously maintained. They poked around for half an hour, jotting notes, until finally one admitted there was nothing to cite. Your property's in better shape than half the city, he said, almost apologetic. Karen, of course, was standing across the street the entire time, arms folded, waiting for her grand victory. When the inspectors walked back to their truck empty-handed, her expression crumbled. She stormed up to them, demanding they look again. There are definitely violations. He's endangering children, she shouted, gesturing like a traffic cop at my yard. The inspectors exchanged looks, muttered something about wasting city resources, and drove off. Karen didn't handle the loss gracefully. That evening, she plastered the HHOA Facebook page with posts claiming corruption, that the inspectors were bribed or incompetent, and that she would personally petition the city council to take action. But the comments section didn't rally behind her. Neighbors had seen her overplay her hand too many times now. Instead of outrage, she got memes. Someone posted a photo of a toy boat in a bathtub with the caption, "Better check this for rodent harborage." Another wrote, "Breaking news. Local Karen discovers Atlantis." I stayed quiet online, but inside I was savoring every second. Her power was slipping, and the harder she clawed, the more ridiculous she looked. But I also knew Karen wasn't just going to fade away. She'd double down, maybe even triple. The question was how. The answer came 2 days later, during a barbecue at my neighbor Steve's place. Steve was one of the few people in the neighborhood who had always kept Karen at arm's length. He had a no-nonsense attitude, the kind of guy who mowed his lawn with military precision but refused to attend a single HOA meeting. As we flipped burgers, he leaned toward me and lowered his voice. "Word is, Karen's been talking about organizing a petition. Wants to amend the HOA bylaws to ban boats entirely. Even the little fishing skiffs." I smirked. "Let me guess. Retroactive so she can target me?" Steve nodded. "That's the idea. But here's the thing, she's losing support. People are tired of her. You've got more allies than you think." Sure enough, a few days later, a shiny stack of petitions appeared in mailboxes. Karen's manifesto was printed in bold font. "Protect our neighborhood. Ban all boats." She framed it as a safety issue, citing mosquito infestations, structural hazards, and decreased property values. She even included grainy photos of my boat in her backyard flood, labeled like crime scene evidence. I wasn't worried. If anything, it was entertaining. Neighbors who used to be quiet suddenly came knocking on my door. Some wanted to reassure me they wouldn't sign. Others wanted to vent about Karen. One woman told me Karen had once threatened to fine her because her Halloween decorations were too frightening for children. Another said Karen had reported his son's skateboard ramp as a nuisance structure. It was like a dam had burst. People were done being quiet. I decided to play the long game. Rather than launch a counter-petition, I let Karen keep digging her hole. But I did something subtle. I started casually mentioning to neighbors how much the boat meant to me. Not in a dramatic way, just anecdote. How I'd taken my son out fishing last summer, how the boat was the one thing that kept me sane after losing my job for a few months, how it wasn't just a toy but a family tradition. I wasn't lying. And the more people heard those stories, the more they saw me as the reasonable guy and Karen as the tyrant. The real turning point came when Karen tried to host a town hall in her backyard. She set up folding chairs, a podium, even a microphone she'd rented. Her idea was to rally support for the petition, to paint herself as the champion of the community. But only a handful of people showed up, and half of them were there for free snack. I lingered at the edge, sipping a soda, while Karen launched into her speech about preserving values and protecting children from nautical hazards. Halfway through, a kid from down the street burst out laughing and shouted, "It's just a boat, Karen!" That cracked the dam. People started chuckling, whispering, rolling their eyes. One guy even asked if kayaks would be banned too, because his kids loved theirs. Karen snapped that all vessels, regardless of size, pose a threat, which only made her sound more ridiculous. By the end of the night, it was clear the tide had turned. The petition barely gathered a dozen signatures, and most of those came from Karen's inner circle, the handful of neighbors who either feared her or owed her favors. The rest of the community? They weren't buying it anymore. But Karen wasn't finished. The next morning, I found a letter taped to my door. It was written in that unmistakable sharp, looping handwriting of hers. "Consider this your final warning," it read. "If you do not remove the boat from the neighborhood, further action will be taken." I laughed out loud. A final warning, as if she were the general of some suburban army. But what caught my eye wasn't the threat, it was the phrase, "remove the boat from the neighborhood." She wasn't just trying to ban it from my yard anymore. She wanted it gone entirely, as if erasing it would erase her humiliation. And that's when I realized, this wasn't about rules, property values, or safety. This was personal. Karen had been embarrassed, publicly and thoroughly, and her pride couldn't handle it. She wasn't fighting for the community anymore. She was fighting for herself. I didn't panic. I didn't even get angry. Instead, I started planning. Because if Karen wanted to play this game to the bitter end, I'd make sure the ending was one she could never forget. And deep down, I knew the next storm wasn't going to come from the sky. It was going to come from me. Karen's letter sat on my kitchen counter for days. Not because I was worried, but because it was so laughably dramatic I couldn't bring myself to throw it away. Every time I walked past it, I half expected thunder to crackle in the background like some low-budget soap opera. "Remove the boat from the neighborhood," she had written, as if she could banish a man's property like a medieval queen banishing a subject. The arrogance was almost impressive. Almost. I decided to treat her final warning not as a threat, but as an invitation. If Karen wanted to escalate, I'd let her. But I wouldn't meet her with shouting or panic. My strategy was always the same: calm, sarcastic precision. The more ridiculous she became, the more reasonable I would look. That's how you win in HOA land, not with rage, but with patience, and sometimes with a touch of theater. The opportunity presented itself faster than I expected. A week later, the HOA announced its annual Summer Safety Fair, one of those bland suburban events meant to justify HOA dues. There'd be food trucks, a bounce house for kids, and booths about fire safety, pest control, and neighborhood watch. Normally, I skipped it. But this year, Karen was in charge of the planning committee. Which meant one thing: it was the perfect stage. I called a buddy who runs a local marine supply store and borrowed a collapsible display tent. I set up a booth at the fair, complete with glossy photos of fishing trips, pamphlets about boat safety, and even a little kiddie pool with model sailboats floating inside. My booth was labeled Neighborhood Boating Education, and I wore a polo shirt with a fake logo I'd printed the night before. If Karen wanted me to remove my boat from the neighborhood, I was going to do the opposite: make boating part of its identity. The reactions were priceless. Parents brought their kids over to play with the toy sailboat. Neighbors stopped to look at the photos and share stories about their own fishing trip. A few even asked if I'd take them out sometime. Karen, meanwhile, was stationed across the field at a booth about community compliance. Her table had a stack of dull bylaw printouts, a poster board scrawled with the words, "Protect Property Values," and a bowl of melting mints. When she saw my booth, her face turned the color of overripe tomatoes. She stormed over, heels stabbing into the grass, and hissed, "You don't have permission to promote this here." I smiled pleasantly. Actually, I registered with the HOA committee last week. Booth number 8, Neighborhood Boating Education. I'm sure you approved it. She sputtered, flipping through her clipboard, but of course she had missed the fine print. One of the quieter board members must have slipped it past her. Watching her scramble in front of a crowd was like watching a magician botch a trick, cringeworthy, but impossible to look away from. Neighbors stared, amused, as Karen barked about illegitimate displays and dangerous propaganda. But the more she ranted, the more people gravitated toward my booth. Kids laughed, parents chatted, and I just kept smiling, offering pamphlets like I was running for mayor of Lake Karen. The board president eventually intervened, gently suggesting Karen return to her own booth. She obeyed, but not without a glare sharp enough to cut glass. Her booth remained empty for most of the afternoon, while mine became the unexpected hit of the fair. By the end of the day, I'd signed up a dozen people for boating outings that may or may not ever happen, and Karen's reputation had sunk lower than her soggy rose bushes. But Karen wasn't someone who absorbed humiliation quietly. That night, I saw her pacing her driveway on the phone, voice shrill enough to carry across the street. She was threatening legal action, claiming I'd violated HOA policies, city ordinances, and probably maritime law for good measure. I let her rant, because I knew something she didn't. When people lose control in public, they don't realize how much damage they're doing to themselves. Karen was unraveling, thread by thread, and everyone could see it. Still, I kept my guard up. The next twist came on a humid Wednesday afternoon. A flatbed tow truck rolled into the neighborhood again. Different company this time, but the intent was obvious. I walked outside just as the driver was eyeing my boat. He told me he'd been contracted by a representative of the Homeowners Association to remove it for safety reasons. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten. I simply asked for the paperwork. The driver showed me a handwritten note on lined notebook paper, signed only HOA President. The problem? Karen wasn't the HOA President. Mark, the accountant, still held that title, and he'd been growing increasingly weary of her antics. Funny, I said, pulling out my phone. Because the actual HOA President is a friend of mine. Let's give him a call right now. I dialed Mark on speaker, right there in front of the tow driver and a handful of neighbors who had gathered to watch. Mark confirmed in his dry, tired voice that no tow had been authorized and that anyone attempting to remove my boat would be trespassing. The driver paled, muttered an apology, and sped off before Karen could even emerge from her house. The neighbors chuckled, shaking their heads. Karen finally appeared, screeching that I'd manipulated the board president and sabotaged community standards. But her fury only fueled more whispers. People were tired of her. The tide had fully turned. That weekend, I got an unexpected knock at my door. It was Mark. He looked exhausted, dark circles under his eyes. "We need to talk," he said, stepping inside. Over coffee, he explained what I already suspected. The rest of the board wanted Karen gone. Her constant overreach, her unilateral decisions, her public meltdowns, they were draining everyone. The petition, the town hall, the boat fiasco, it had all added up. But removing her wasn't simple. The bylaws allowed for impeachment, but it required a majority vote of the entire community. "Would you support it?" Mark asked. I nearly laughed. "Support it? I'll build the stage for it." The plan was set in motion. Over the next few weeks, board members quietly gathered support. Neighbors who had once feared Karen began signing pledges. Stories of her past outbursts resurfaced. Her threats over Halloween decorations, her vendetta against the kids' skateboard ramp, her obsession with regulating lawn ornament. The community had tolerated her for years, but now they had proof she wasn't just strict, she was unstable. Karen must have sensed something, because her behavior grew even more frantic. She patrolled the neighborhood daily, clipboard in hand, jotting down imaginary violations. She shouted at kids riding bikes, screamed at gardeners for mowing too early, even berated the mailman for walking across her grass. It was as if she thought doubling down would restore her control. But it had the opposite effect. Neighbors filmed her tirades, shared them online, and the Lake Karen joke evolved into something larger. People started calling her Admiral Karen, the self-appointed ruler of our suburban seas. Memes circulated with her face photoshopped onto naval captains, standing in front of my boat. Through it all, I stayed calm. I kept mowing my lawn, polishing my boat, waving politely when she shrieked from across the street. The calmer I was, the more unhinged she appeared. For a couple of weeks after Karen's impeachment, the neighborhood was almost unnervingly calm. No flyers taped to mailboxes, no screaming fits in the cul-de-sac, no frantic Facebook essays about preserving property values. It was like someone had switched off the static that had been buzzing constantly in the background for years. People lingered outside more often now. Kids played basketball in driveways without fear of a citation, and even the mailman whistled on his route. It was bliss. But if there was one thing I'd learned about Karen, it was that she was never finished. Her need for control wasn't a quirk, it was her identity. And when someone loses their identity, they don't quietly accept it. They thrash. They claw. They reinvent themselves in whatever way keeps them relevant. I didn't have to wait long to see what form Karen's reinvention would take. It started with a rumor. A neighbor mentioned that Karen had been spotted at city council meetings, cornering officials during recess and unloading her grievances about lawless boat owners and negligent homeowners. Another said she'd filed some kind of formal complaint with the zoning commission, though nobody knew what exactly she was claiming. I wasn't surprised. When the HOA no longer gave her the power she craved, she simply tried to climb higher up the ladder. Then came the storm. Not a metaphorical one this time. A literal thunderstorm, the kind that sweeps in with black skies and wind that rattles windows. By midnight, the streets were rivers, drains overwhelmed, and the familiar low-lying spots of the neighborhood filled like bathtubs. I stood on my porch, rain hammering the roof, and watched the water rise across the cul-de-sac. Déjà vu settled over me. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind its usual scars. Puddles deep enough to swallow bike tires, lawns slick with mud, and, most notably, Karen's backyard, once again transformed into an accidental lake. I half expected her to have learned her lesson after the last flood, to have installed drains or at least considered landscaping. But no. There it was again, Lake Karen, shimmering under the sun. And this time, the water was deeper. I knew exactly what to do. I spent the morning preparing, but not in the way Karen probably imagined. I didn't haul my boat over out of spite or blast music in victory. Instead, I treated it like an event. I texted a few neighbors, casually mentioning that the boat would probably find its way into Lake Karen again. Within an hour, the entire cul-de-sac was buzzing. People brought lawn chairs, coolers, and cameras. By noon, it looked less like a flood and more like a festival. When I finally guided my boat out of my yard and into hers, cheers erupted. Kids clapped, adults laughed, someone even blasted the Gilligan's Island theme from a Bluetooth speaker. The boat floated perfectly, anchored just off her deck stairs like it had been custom designed for this absurd backyard marina. Karen emerged onto her porch, horror etched across her face. She wore a neon rain poncho that made her look like an emergency cone, her hair frizzing in every direction. Her shriek cut through the laughter. "This is harassment. This is targeted harassment." I raised my hands innocently. "Karen, I can't control where the water flows. Nature seems to have chosen your yard as the neighborhood harbor. I'm just making the best of it." The neighbors howled. Someone yelled, "Admiral Karen, welcome back to command." Another asked if she'd start charging docking fees. Karen's face twisted in rage, but the more she yelled, the more absurd she looked. People weren't afraid of her anymore. They were entertained by her. And then came the moment that sealed her fate. A local news crew showed up. Apparently, one of the neighbors had tipped them off, and the phrase "Lake Karen" was too irresistible to ignore. They filmed the boat bobbing in her yard, interviewed neighbors who gleefully recounted her history of HOA tyranny, and even asked me for a statement. I kept my tone calm and reasonable, explaining how the floods were a recurring issue, how my boat had simply followed the water, and how the neighborhood had come together to make light of a frustrating situation. Karen, of course, barged into the interview, shouting about conspiracies and sabotage. She waved soggy bylaw papers at the camera, accusing me of orchestrating the storm itself. The cameraman didn't even bother cutting away. Her meltdown was too perfect. By that evening, the clip was circulating online, captioned with phrases like, "Lake Karen strikes again," and "HOA Queen meets her Waterloo." The story exploded. Local stations ran it as a quirky human interest piece. Memes spread across social media. One had Karen's face photoshopped onto a sinking ship with the caption, "Abandon HOA." Another showed my boat in her yard with the words, "New neighborhood pool, admission free." Within days, Karen became infamous, not just in our neighborhood but across the city. Strangers drove by just to see the house where Lake Karen lived. Cars slowed to take photos. Teenagers posed for selfies at the edge of her flooded yard. It was the kind of humiliation you don't recover from, not when you've built your life around authority and appearances. The final nail came from the city itself. The coverage had embarrassed officials enough that they investigated the flooding. Turns out, Karen had refused multiple recommendations over the years to improve her drainage, insisting it was unnecessary. The city fined her for negligence, citing her refusal to comply with code. They gave her 60 days to install proper drains or face escalating penalties. Karen disappeared from public view after that. The curtains stayed drawn, the porch light off, no more clipboards or patrols. Occasionally, I'd glimpse her darting to her car, sunglasses on, head down, as if hoping the world would forget. But the world doesn't forget, not when the internet has immortalized your meltdown in high definition. As for me, life returned to something resembling normal. I polished the boat, mowed the lawn, and waved at neighbors who now greeted me like an old friend. Every so often, someone would joke about throwing another Lake Karen festival if the rains came back. I just smiled and said we'd see. Because here's the truth, I never set out to destroy Karen. All I ever wanted was to be left alone, to enjoy my property without being micromanaged by someone with too much time and not enough self-awareness. But when people like her push, sometimes the best response isn't to push back. It's to let them collapse under the weight of their own obsession. Karen tried to tow my boat, to erase me. But in the end, she only managed to tow herself straight into a flood she couldn't escape. And me? I didn't have to lift a finger. I just floated. The neighborhood never looked the same after that. Without Karen's constant shadow, people relaxed. Kids' bikes leaned against fences without threat of violation notices. Neighbors organized block parties without worrying about aesthetic permits. Even the HOA board seemed lighter, more focused on real issues like fixing sidewalks and arranging trash pickup. It was as if we'd all been holding our breath for years, and finally, we could exhale.